Okay, so we're nearing the end of the content for this chapter, and pretty much the rest of the content I'm going to leave in your hands and give you some work to do to work through it and read about it, take some notes, answer some questions on your own to learn about it. And that last bit of content is going to be about the great strikes of this era that we're discussing. So before I set you to work on that and have you go through that information on your own, I have a few more things I want to put in your notes just to prep this last piece. So we are picking up in our notes where we wrote down the last few bullet points about the lives of the working class people. In fact, what we had written down in our notes is more about the working lives of these working class people. You then did a little work on learning about their living conditions and the way they lived their lives outside of work, as you read about Jacob Riis, his book, How the Other Half Lives. Hopefully you already watched the little video that sort of elaborates on Jacob Riis and the research that he did. So at this point, we have a pretty good sense of what the working conditions were like for these working class people, as well as what the living conditions were like for these working class people. And all of that is important to understand this next and final piece. Speaking of the living conditions, I know in our last discussion we looked at this one particular image that Jacob Riis took in a tenement house, but you also got to see many more images from Jacob Riis's camera as you watched the little documentary. So, all right, so this is what we're picking up in our notes. And we can put a new heading, Unions and the Great Strikes. As I said, you're going to be reading about and covering most of this information on your own, but we're just going to put a few things down to get you started. First of all, one of the things that we've already discussed about this era is that as this time went on into the 1860s, the 1870s, the 1880s, the 1890s, the things didn't get better necessarily. In fact, we said last time that things got worse. The working conditions got harsher. The living conditions got worse for these people. And part of the reason is because the businesses and the industries continued to get bigger, and they continued to grow, and the wealth continued to expand, and the power of these businesses and these business leaders continued to grow. But what also grew was the distance between the rich leaders of these businesses and the poor working class people that were working in these businesses. So the way I always put it is that the gap between the rich and the poor continued to grow. So actually, I'm going to just thought of this right now. I'll put something on the board here. What happened was this. Obviously, when this era was forming, you had this small group of people rise to the top, the Andrew Carnegies and the J.D. Rockefellers of the world, and then you had a massive group of people down here who were the working class poor. And clearly, as there is in any society, especially a capitalist society like ours, even still today, there is a gap. There are differences between the lives of rich people and there are poor people, and there is this space between them, right? So that makes sense. But as this era continued to go on and these businesses continued to grow and get bigger and more powerful, the rich were moving in this direction. And so the gap was getting bigger. That's not the worst of it, though. The worst part is that these people down at the bottom here, these poor people, they weren't staying here as the rich were widening the gap. Unfortunately, what was happening is the poor were actually getting poorer. So this gap was widening both ways, and it was growing, I guess we could say, almost exponentially. That is a tough situation for anybody to live under for a very extended period of time. And so that's sort of a preface to where we're headed here, okay? All right, so a couple other things, and I might go back to that example on the board here in a second. So let me give you an example, a statistical example, some numbers to help you understand what we're talking about here with this gap between the rich and the poor. In 1890, for example, 75% of the wealth in the United States of America was owned and controlled by only 9% of the population. Now, 75% of the wealth in the United States in the late 1800s, as we have learned in this Gilded Age, was a massive amount of wealth. 75% of that was controlled by a very small portion of the population, 9% of the people. That meant that the remaining 25% of all the wealth in our country had to be shared by what percentage of the people? 91% of the people had to somehow fight for the other 25%. So if we want to try to visualize that, and again, the numbers, I tell you this all the time when we hit statistics and we do numbers, the numbers aren't necessarily that important, but just understanding the meaning of these numbers is what I want you to understand, so maybe this will help. So if we took all the wealth in the United States, and there would be this really big portion of it up here, like 75% of it is up here, right? So we have 75% of all the money. Okay? That is being owned and controlled by a small 9% of the rich in our society. That meant that you had 25% of the money left, so that circle is going to be something more like that of the money that's left down here. But you have 91% of the population that's trying to share all of that, or that limited amount of wealth that is left. You've got this small group with a lot of wealth and a massive group with a very small part of the wealth. That situation, as people started to become more and more familiar with it and recognize what the real situation was, created a situation, I guess, or an environment where this couldn't continue to exist that way. And on top of that, go back to what we talked about with Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth and some of his philosophies. If you were to ask this 9% of the population up here, whose fault was it that 91% of the population were poor? That this massive amount of working class people were in poverty, were living in those slums and those tenements. Whose fault is it? Well, from the Andrew Carnegie's viewpoints and the J.D. Rockefeller's viewpoint, obviously it was their own fault for that, right? And if you start to dig a little bit deeper, again, start to scratch away that gilded outer layer of what America was looked like, you'd start to see that there was probably other reasons for that. And so the massive amount of poor people were not going to continue to live like this and do nothing about it. They didn't believe that it was fair, and it became a very tense situation. Let's just put it in terms of our class. If there are 10 of us in our class, and I want to create an example that's similar to this, I'd say, all right, I'm feeling real generous. I got $100. And I'm going to divvy it up to you guys. I'm going to share it with all of you, all 10 of you. But I'm going to share it with you the same way the wealth was dispersed and distributed in 1890. So that means I'm going to take $75 and I'm going to give it to one of you, to Joey. How much do I have left? I got $25 left, right? Well, I'm going to take that remaining 25 and I'm going to break it up to the rest of you, the other 9 of you, which is going to be like less than $2.50. Let's just say you all get $2. Joey's going to get $75. I'm going to do that every day when you come in. It's cool, yeah, every day you show up to Bible class, you're going to get $2 for nothing. I'm just going to hand it to you, put it in your pocket. That's pretty awesome. But while I'm doing that, I'm also going to be giving $75 to one of you, to Joey. How do you think the class is going to react to that over time? You think people are going to start looking at Joey a little differently? You think there might be some tension that starts to develop among the 9 of you that are getting $2 every day, looking the way you look at Joey who's getting $75? You think maybe somebody in the class might be waiting for Joey out in the parking lot one day to be like, hey, I think we got to do something about this situation, right? Well, that was what was happening in our country. The tension was growing to a point where the working class poor were no longer going to be able to sit by and just take this. And so that's what leads us to what we're going to be calling the era of the Great Strikes. You're going to be reading about some of the great strikes that occurred. You're going to be looking at 4, maybe 5 of them. I think there's 4 of them that I'm going to have you reading about and writing some things down so you'll get to know and understand what was going on with these strikes based on these 4 or 5. But what I want you to understand as you're reading about these is that in the years 1880 to 1900, in this 20-year period, there were over 24,000 strikes that happened all over the country in all different cities in all different businesses. You're going to be learning about just about 4 of them. But as you're doing that, remember that there were thousands of these, tens of thousands of these instances that occurred in our country. So I'm going to leave you there, and you are going to be doing some work to learn about labor unions and these great strikes. The directions that you're going to be reading when you open up this assignment, they will tell you that you need to answer these questions in your notes. And unlike usual, whenever I give you assignments, I am going to allow you to answer these questions in your notes about the great strikes in what we call note form. You're not going to have to write complete sentences. If you want to put it in terms of bullet points and phrases and things like that, you can do that. So if you have questions, other questions about the assignment as you start to work on it, email me, reach out, let me know. Good luck, and enjoy learning about the great strikes.